Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Visual Studio Toolbox Live. I am your host, Leslie Richardson, and today I am so excited because we're going to be talking about accessibility, how it relates to tech, and how accessibility is used in relation to Visual Studio. So, to joining me today in order to talk about this topic is the wonderful Dante Gagne. Sorry, I think I botched your name. Your last name.
Yeah, it's okay.
Is Dante from the editor team. He's a program manager from Visual Studio editor team. Welcome, Dante.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, my name's Dante. I'm the editor PM for Visual Studio. I'm also the divisional driver for developer tools here at Microsoft. So that's Visual Studio, VS Code, VS for Mac, MakeCode, folks like that. And I'm really glad to get a chance to just chat with you about accessibility, the things we've done, the things we're doing in the future, and just get a chance to talk to the community a little bit.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. For those of you who don't know, Dante is kind of like the go-to guy for all things accessibility in addition to the editor when it comes to Visual Studio. So this is really cool, and I think we're going to have a great discussion today.
Thank you.
So just right off the bat, before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you explain a little bit about what accessibility actually is and how it relates to tech and why it's so important for tech?
Gladly. So accessibility, the way I think of it, is everything that has to do with allowing everybody to use your software. I mean, on the simplest level, that's what it is. I mean, the Microsoft mission of empowering everyone on the planet to do more kind of falls into accessibility. So we design Visual Studio, we design a lot of our applications, we design the user experience for computers with somebody who uses a mouse and uses a keyboard. What happens when you can't use a mouse? What happens when you can't see the screen? What happens when you can't hear the sounds coming out of your computer? And even more than that, what happens when the way you look at the world is a little bit different based on the way your neurological makeup goes? All of this is accessibility. There's also, today, my interactions might be different from tomorrow. If I were to break one arm, certainly I hope it doesn't happen, but I want to still be able to get my work done even when I'm in a different situation. So accessibility is all of this. When I first started with accessibility, a lot of it was, can a screen reader work? Can you use narrator with Visual Studio? So you've got no mouse, you've got a keyboard, and you can't see your screen. Can you do Visual Studio? And while we've done a lot of work in that area, there's a lot more to it. There's, folks use Braille displays. There are folks who can't hear audio cues. And more an area that we're learning about are folks who, say, show up on the autistic spectrum or have cognitive learning-based disability. There are things that we can do to make the product a little bit better. So accessibility, in my mind, is all the things that we need to keep in mind to help everybody be as productive as they can be with the software. I mean, there's that first level, can you use it? I mean, quite frankly, some of the earlier versions of Visual Studio could not be used if you had a screen reader, all the way up to today where we feel pretty good that somebody with a screen reader can use it, but can they be as productive as we want them to be? And that's the space that I think of most when I'm talking about accessibility.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think in the past with me especially, I've had a tendency to just assume accessibility, it's about being when you're blind or when you're deaf, but there's so much more to it. Like you mentioned, like cognitive differences and stuff, and how we can develop tech that caters to everybody, but with people, whether you're blind or deaf or neurodivergent or any of those. So that's cool.
It's a challenge. And worldwide, there are a set of laws. The World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, has got a set of guidelines that say, this is what we claim you need to be able to do to be accessible. So for instance, the color contrast of text against its background needs to be, they use a mathematical formula to determine not only can people who have lower vision be able to tell, but people who are maybe red-green colorblind, it's part of that calculation as well. It needs to meet a certain color contrast ratio. There are hard guidelines that say, meet these guidelines, otherwise there are people who won't be able to use your software. That doesn't address that second half of, okay, sure, I can read it, but maybe the letters are so tiny that I'm squinting anyway. That's, okay, we're meeting the guidelines, but we're not helping people be as productive as they want to be. And those guidelines they're starting to do more on things like cognitive load. For instance, have you ever reset your password and gotten a little CAPTCHA box that says, what are these characters? I mean,
Yep.
First off, those are usually not screen reader accessible. But secondly, folks who have cognitive disabilities, they have a hard time reading what that is. The new guidelines actually have guidelines to make sure that folks with cognitive differences can also use the software. But that's a very emerging area. There's a lot of discovery that we're doing there that we're just learning how to do it better. And it's an area I'm actually really excited to do a lot with. I'm personally was diagnosed with ADHD back in 2003. And over the last couple of years, I've been learning more and more about just what that means as a person, as a developer, as an engineer, all of these spaces. And I don't think I'm the only one who's doing a lot of learning there. So I'm really glad to be a part of advancing that space and helping people with all abilities, just be more productive and stuff.
Yeah, it's totally important. And even on the CAPTCHA example, like I have problems reading that sometimes. Like I don't know what you're doing with the letter and then the pattern in front of it. Like it's
yeah, it's called a cognitive test. And now the rules go so far as to say, actually the rules I'm talking about right now are in the next draft of those, but it's saying that you can't require cognitive tests to be the only way to do it. But if you don't have a cognitive test, how do you make sure a hacker bot isn't doing it? And this is one of the challenges with accessibility, is that you don't want to have to pick between security or accessibility, or accessibility and usability and things like that. And in some cases, it's challenging to meet all of those needs. One example, we were actually talking about this recently, is I used to work on the expression blend team. And one of the things that we did was we muted out the colors of everything else, all the panels on the sides, along the top and bottom. They were kind of more muted colors to keep the focus on the design surface in the middle. This was done, I think it was called focus forward or concept forward. I don't remember the term for it, but it was done to keep your focus in the center of the screen. And we've gotten feedback from folks with cognitive differences that this helps keep my focus where I need it to be, in the middle of the screen. Unfortunately, folks who have visual disabilities find it harder, that those muted colors make it harder for everything to kind of fade into the background, makes it harder to see. So how do you address both of those? And what we're discovering more and more is its configurability. It's realizing that the environment that we provide to help folks with a visual disability may not be the best one for folks with a cognitive disability. The features that we put in place for folks who use screen readers, they may not get a lot of use by folks who don't use screen readers, but we got to make sure that when we're looking at our telemetry that we're not missing what's really valuable to that community. It really puts a whole new spin on a lot of the lessons that I've learned. I've been here at Microsoft now almost 18 years. No, almost 19 years now. And I've been a PM for about 10, program manager. And a lot of the lessons we learned of, well, if only 1% of your users are using this, maybe that's not a feature to invest in. You can make that statement, but if that 1% represents every screen reader user we've got because it's so vital to that experience, then that 1% really doesn't tell the whole story. And that's where getting out and talking with the community is really important. We need that feedback and not let ourselves just let the raw numbers make our decisions for us.
Mm-hmm. Nice comment from somebody in the chat. Sometimes only 2% is what pays the bills. I like that.
Yeah, and we always, when we're looking at telemetry, we are looking at where the enterprise customers are and folks like that. But I can say that the community of folks with disabilities who are using Visual Studio is going up. And this is one of the parts that was really exciting to me. We did a survey recently. So I have to imagine a large number of Visual Studio users have gotten that, hey, we'd love to hear your feedback, gold bar at the top, to ask folks how they're doing. Well, we changed that survey a little bit recently to give folks a chance to say, do you have a disability and are there assistive technologies that you use? Whoop, okay, I'm back. And we found out that almost 1 in 5 Visual Studio users have got a disability of some kind, 20%, which to me, I think is kind of it was a little bit of a surprising number at first. And folks who use a screen reader make up almost 3% of our user base. So it's not the small, tiny, oh, this is only used by maybe a couple hundred users. No, these are tens of thousands of users are using screen readers. And that's why I keep thinking it's so important for us to be on top of making sure that we have the tests in place to make sure that we're not screwing up the screen reader support, because it's easy for sighted developers to not realize that cascading issue that a change might have.
Yeah. And it must be a really tricky balancing act, because like one thing that might work for one group of people may not work for another person, or vice versa. So
Exactly. That's why one of the tools we use here on the engineering team is Accessibility Insights. We use this tool a lot, and it helps. Everything that you're working on in Visual Studio has got an automation tree behind it. So every button has got an automation tree that says, yes, it's a button, which means it can be evoked. It has this text on it. It has this help text on it and things like that. And that's what the screen readers use. If you're working with a normal sighted user with a keyboard and a mouse, they might change it and not realize that they screwed up those properties. And screwing up those properties means it doesn't work for a screen reader. So Accessibility Insights is one of the tools that we use constantly to say, okay, I'm about to make this change, Accessibility Insights. Oh, hey, I forgot that controls, I goofed up its name. Now I can go back and fix it. And it's reduced the number of instances we've had where we've broken those screen readers. A great example of that, I believe it was Visual Studio 2019, one of the early previews. We released the new version, the start window, and we completely missed the fact that all of the buttons for create a new project, branch, create a branch, not a branch, enlist in a GitHub repo and everything like that, those buttons were missing their automation names. So to the screen reader, it said button, 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 and you had to guess which one was which. We actually did a servicing release for a preview to fix that one because it got past us and we didn't want to leave those users behind. And I'm really glad that we did that one. And now because of that, we implemented all of these new checks to make sure we don't make that mistake again. But yeah, it's always a balancing act. And one of the things I probably spend more than half my week chatting with engineers saying, how do I fix this problem? What should it be doing? And like, I'll get questions. How do we know if a screen reader is attached? You don't. You shouldn't. You shouldn't be behaving differently if a screen reader is attached. Because if you are, if a bug shows up in that specialized branch, are you going to catch it? Are all your automated tests, are they testing it with and without a screen reader? No, they're not. And in fact, we can't tell. Screen readers are designed to be non-intrusive, which means from the outside, we can't identify if a screen reader is running or not without doing some things that would be terrible breaches of privacy, like checking to see the processes that are run. We can't do that. We won't do that. But there used to be a time when you could tell, but the mechanisms that were put in place for screen readers are the same ones used for touchscreens or pen stylus and things like that. So now we can tell, yeah, this version of Visual Studio is being used on a machine that has a screen reader or a touch display or a stylus, or before long, everything flags. It's like, well, okay, we can't trust that anymore. But like I said, we shouldn't need to know. We shouldn't have to know. So rely on the tools. That's how it works better.
Yeah. So you've been in the accessibility space for how long now?
I was in the accessibility space for a little while back in 2008. I was there only for about a year. And then I came out of it for a handful of reasons and then got back into it around 2015 or 16. That was when I started it up. And the main reason why I switched was when I first did it, that was during a time when Microsoft was just ramping up on the Trustworthy Computing initiative, where we wanted to spend more time on accessibility, security, and things to that effect. But it didn't really have buy-in from all of our leadership. And at that time, there were recommendations of, hey, here's how we could be more accessible. And everything was prioritized on, well, that's really only a very small percentage of our users. We'll get to it eventually. And I eventually came out of it because honestly, it was kind of discouraging to recognize these problems that we had and nobody was interested in addressing it.
Yeah.
Satya now is our CEO. He has recommitted us to accessibility. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was one of the folks they said, we could use somebody who's got that interest in accessibility, a little bit more knowledge. And I was invited to become the divisional lead for developer tools. And this time, maybe not on day one, but that dedication to accessibility was a lot stronger. We had Scott Guthrie coming out and telling teams, oh, you don't know if you're accessible or not? You're not releasing, full stop. And I remember a very uncomfortable meeting. We had VPs in the room, we had executives in the room, and one of the teams was saying, well, we're not worrying as much about accessibility until later. And a comment by a senior VP, I'm not sure if I should mention the name or not, was, well, we could also cut your product and then you don't have to worry about accessibility at all. And the room went dead silent. No one had any idea how to respond. And then after a good second or two, the same VP said, why don't we have a conversation offline about this? I don't, like I said, I don't want to call out that team. That team has actually become one of the better teams in terms of accessibility because they realize, no, this is a priority. This is something our leadership really cares about and is taking seriously. And that has propagated out, which has made it more satisfying for me to do my job, to engage with the teams and help them understand and prioritize what it means to be accessible and to be the voice. I spend a lot of time chatting with various communities. A shout out to the Program L folks, which is a mailing list for blind developers, who I get a lot of great feedback to know how can we do a better job. And it gives me that opportunity to bring that voice to the various teams across Microsoft, across the developer tools, and help people just learn how we can do a better job.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's cool to just see how much buy-in has escalated in just a short time frame for accessibility. So that's really cool. Has there been any other evolutionary things that you've seen in the accessibility space in recent years too?
Abolitionary. Okay, I'm going to share my ignorance here. What do you ask?
Oh, like, I mean, what else have you seen change in the?
Thank you. A lot, really. When we first started this exercise, I had to explain to people what screen readers were. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I actually went through the screen reader training on one of the more popular screen readers out there, and I learned what it meant to actually interact. It's a whole different mental model. I had to explain to engineers what a screen reader was, what were just some of the most basic things. Back when we had offices I could walk around in, I would hear developers listening to their application with narrator running, or even saying, here, let me hold this. Let me let you see what narrator is saying. Is that okay? That step where we were actually engineers day to day, it wasn't so much every team had one champion, one person here and there who knew. Engineers across the board understood what it meant to be accessible, and they started to take into account what it meant. We got into design reviews with our user experience team. And one of the things with Visual Studio is every piece of UI in VS, if you've got VS running, everything that you're looking at has been reviewed by our UX board. So it's a group of head designers to make sure that there's consistency in how we present things. As somebody who's been with Visual Studio for a while, they've really made a lot of positive changes. But one of the other things I did was now we started talking about accessibility at the design phase. Satya's got a great quote that said accessibility can't be a bolt-on. It can't be something that we're going to do everything and then add accessibility later. You can do that, but it's never going to feel as organic as if you design for accessibility in the front. So that before we would have design reviews and folks would say, oh, I didn't even think about that one. Now the designers are asking this. When a designer is being assigned to a project, they're thinking about this up front. I actually have had PMs ask me, where can I get the list of the WCAG guidelines that we're supposed to be adhering to? It's become part of the culture. And it's similar when I first started with Blend. Localization was something that we had to learn. Security was something that we built the tools to learn, and it became second nature. Accessibility is on that path. It's not all the way there yet, but it's gotten a lot better than it was. And that's really one of the things I give a lot of credit to the engineers who got the issues and didn't stop at, I just want to do what's right. How do I get this bug off my plate? They wanted to learn, how do I get so these bugs don't show up again? And why is this even a bug?
Right.
That learning that folks have done has really driven it forward.
Yeah, that's really exciting to see. And I also think that's part of why having representation is so important, because once you have people who experience this stuff on a daily basis in the room, such as you, for instance, like you can pick up on that stuff much faster, I can imagine, like when you're in the design phases and not everything's out in the open yet. So
I try to, but I still learn as we go along. I mean, it's a space I will never stop learning on this one. Recently, I found a very interesting case. A gentleman who actually works at Microsoft, his vision is, I can't remember the term for it, but in the morning, he's got full vision. And then over the course of the day, depending on the amount of light that his retina absorbs, his vision steadily degrades. So he starts off at the beginning of the day, full vision. Then over the course of the day, he starts using magnifier. And then by the end of the day, he's probably got a screen reader going. And just that evolution over the day, this is something I never knew about, but we need to be able to do the whole spectrum. And in his case, it has to do with the amount of light that his retina absorbs. He says, I use dark mode for everything. Windows, Visual Studio, because if it's only bright white, it is more light. It's going to literally degrade the number of minutes I'll be able to see in the day.
Wow. This
is just something that I've incorporated, and I'm thinking about, and again, it goes back to the configuration. We want users to be able to configure VS to be best for them. And that really is different from person to person to person.
Mm-hmm. So on the topic of VS specifically, what kinds of accessibility features exist in Visual Studio today?
So right now, a lot of the things that we're doing is meeting the compliance. We really want to understand those WCAG guidelines, the Worldwide Web Consortium accessibility. Oh, okay. Now I'm not remembering them, but
was that acronym CAD?
What's that?
Or what was that acronym in full?
WCAG.
Okay.
WCAG is how it's usually pronounced, but it's the something guideline, accessibility guidelines. I should know it off the top of my head, but I don't. But we're really trying to meet those and make sure that we're meeting all the requirements of just being accessible. But we've added a few features. One of the ones that we did recently is line spacing. So this is for folks who have reading disabilities or cognitive disabilities. Character crowding is a real issue. So one of the things that we did was we made it so you can increase the amount of spacing between lines. This is something Word and Office has had forever, and it was more stylistic, but in reality, it can help people who have character dysmorphia, dyslexia, things like that, just make it easier to read the characters. We also, with Visual Studio 2022, the first preview that just came out, we switched from Consulus, which has been the default font for since we were banging rocks together, to it's a Cascadia Mono, which is a new font that has a little bit more weight on some of the characters that we've shown is more readable with folks who have learning disabilities, as well as it introduces ligatures. If you want to turn those on, you can, in Tools Options, go from Cascadia Mono to Cascadia Code, and the ligatures can help folks with the cognitive differences be able to see symbols that are more in line with not equals to, is more like the mathematical not equals to, instead of the greater than, less than, or exclamation point equal, which is a little bit cryptic for some folks. And it's a stylistic choice for some. It makes the code easier to use for others. And that was another change that we recently did. And other than that, we're always trying to engage with the community to learn new things. We just published a blog on the Visual Studio blog talking about some of the things that we're investigating. So let me throw a question at you. When you code, do you prefer tabs or spaces?
Oh gosh, coming out with it, tabs.
Okay. So this has been a debate that's been hotly discussed for years. I used to be in the spaces camp, actually. And tabs won me over, and I'll tell you why. Magnifier users, they take their entire screen and crunch it down to an area that zooms up larger, but they can only see kind of a little viewpoint at a time. They like the white space indentation to be narrower, so they don't have to do as much left-right scrolling. On the flip side of that, folks with cognitive differences like their code spaced out a little bit more. So they want more space between lines and more white space indentation. It spreads everything out and makes it easier to understand. Visual Studio already has a setting that says use 8 spaces to represent tabs, or use 1 space to represent tabs, which will allow you that control if you're working in a code document that uses tabs. If you use spaces, we can't do anything about it, because 4 spaces is 4 spaces. It's this width. Well, that statement, we can't do anything about it, isn't really true, because we own the rendering system underneath. We know that those 4 spaces are white space. One of the things that we've got a theory that might help people is, what if we gave you the control to say, you know, if you've got 4 spaces that represent indentation, only render it with 1 character width, or render it with 8 character width, even though it's a different number of spaces. we think that would actually be useful for folks. So the blog post that you shared the link to a moment ago, it's got links to our feedback channels that can let people say, yeah, that would actually be useful for me. And if we get that feedback from the community, we know that this is something that we can invest our time in. If we don't get that feedback, then we can look at something else. Like I've got a handful of items up there, and I'm always going through our feedback channels looking for those things that would be useful for those communities because they have value. And like many of those cases, the work that we've done to make Visual Studio keyboard accessible to everybody are things that people absolutely love. Just the power users, they say, I don't want to use my mouse. I know I'm not the person that you made sure didn't need to use my mouse, but thanks to that work, I don't have to use my mouse. They can be more efficient and they can tear through the code and do a lot more in that respect. The work that we do, even though the original inspiration for that work may be folks with a particular ability or disability, it turns into a product that's more useful for everybody. And that's one of the more exciting things that I really love working with here.
Yeah, that's really cool. So on that topic of being able to develop accessible tools like line spacing, can you walk us through what that process was like specifically for line spacing or any other accessibility tools that you did?
So line spacing was one that, talking to the community, I started hearing the signals from folks. We do a lot of usability studies, and some of those usability studies are specifically focused on people with disabilities. And we started getting signals from folks specifically with cognitive or learning-based disabilities that everything being that crowded was a problem. And it made it harder to read. And we showed mock-ups of this is what your code would look like with line spacing. That, oh my God, that's so much better to do. So, okay, now we've got the signal. From there, we turn it into a feature on our backlog, and our backlog represents all the things that we think have got value. Yeah. The very first item on the backlog, that's the one we're going to tackle first. And then this got put in there, and initially all new features come in low, and then we start reaching out to the community and saying, how valuable would this be? Accessibility gets a special rule, and that is when you're talking to folks with a disability, pretend everybody has got that disability and then rank it. So instead of asking the question, here it is with line spacing, here it is without line spacing, which one is better? We said of the people who have a cognitive or learning disability, 98% of them felt that the version with the line spacing was easier to read. Now, let's prioritize this as if everybody was in that group and 90% of all Visual Studio users would find that more usable. That's huge. It would impact everybody. We would prioritize it higher. If we didn't do that, any feature that kind of limited itself to a particular disability, it would be hard to get it to move. Now, as I mentioned before, the number of people who have disabilities is a lot higher than we originally thought it was, but it still is kind of hard to sell that, well, screen reader users make up 3 to 4%, but C# developers make up, I don't even know what the percentage is, but let's say 40%. 40%, 3%. How do we weigh those against it? Well, what if that 3% was we pretended every user needed a screen reader? Well, then it comes up and we can weigh them more evenly. It doesn't mean every feature that is in that disability bucket immediately gets prioritized higher, but it gives us a better opportunity to weigh them and give them a chance to get done. And then we were able to implement it. We put it as a preview feature. Actually, that one wasn't a preview feature since it was an opt-in option. And then we immediately started going to the community. Hey, here's the feature that y'all asked for. Is it working? And we got a lot of people coming back. Oh my God, this makes things better. We love this one. Thank you so much. Great. This is a feature. Not that it was in danger of being removed or anything, but it reinforced for us that when you do something that helps that community, more and more people are getting it. Now, it's kind of interesting, that particular feature, one of the other issues we have is that people can't find options.
Yeah.
Have you looked at tools options lately?
It's a mess. There's just a lot.
It is. And it's one of those areas that we would love to get some improvements on. One of the other features I mentioned is the ability to filter options based on categories. So just show me accessibility related features. I would wager that of the people watching this, probably half of them have got one setting somewhere in tools options that would make them feel better, but they don't even know it exists.
Totally.
That's something that we really want to help. If you've got a learning disability, might be a little bit more useful if we can help you find, here are the things that would make your life that much better. That's another one of the ones that I mentioned in my blog post that we'd love to get the feedback of. what are categories that people would want? Is just visual related ones enough? Would it be useful to filter them based on reading versus typing versus motion impairments? And this is what we want to get those conversations. And really, one of the reasons why I was so excited that you invited me to come chat with you today is we really want to engage with the community. We want to hear from folks, yes, these are things that would make my life better. And really, one of the things I respect a lot about the folks who have disabilities is they don't want to put a spotlight on it. Ask a developer how they feel about whether or not a menu should have capital letters. They will tell you in large posts I remember that. Sorry.
Flashbacks.
Yeah, exactly. But folks with disabilities, I've found, don't always want to come forward and say, yes, I would be better if this is it, because they don't want to feel like they have to ask somebody to make their lives better. The reality is we're looking for those opportunities to do it. So we really want to engage with folks and kind of pull them out and get a chance to hear what they say. The other downside, and I'll be completely transparent with this one, for a while, we had a feedback process that if somebody posted something and it didn't get enough votes, it would say, you know what, we're focusing on things that have a wider impact on the community.
Yeah. Yep.
That really was not and we learned from that. We changed that process, and now we have a better process that says we take everything seriously. And when it comes to feedback, we tag things internally. This is an accessibility item. And internally, if somebody wants to close an accessibility item, they have to actually talk to me about it first, because it's another case where, maybe you tell the debugging team that you've got something that you need and they're only hearing a few people. But if the debugger team's hearing it, the editor is hearing it, the project system is hearing it, the C# Roslyn team is hearing it, but everybody's only hearing it from a few sources, bring all that together, that's kind of a large signal. So that our process has changed there. But yeah, it really is about talking to folks and getting those chances. I'm always happy to hear from folks. Feedback on the developer community, reach out to me directly on Twitter. Let us know what could be better. And that's really why I'm glad to get a chance to chat with your community here today.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's really cool how your team prioritizes your backlog like that. Basically treating it as if everybody had a disability and how that would weigh out essentially the votes for a different feature differently. I think that's really cool.
It's we're still learning from. There is a danger of it going too far. There was an example of a feature that it was somewhere in the Azure team. I don't remember exactly which team. They had reached out to a particular blind developer and asked for feedback on how could we make this better. And that developer gave a lot of very targeted feedback. The feature implemented a great deal of it. And then when it rolled out, it turned out that it only worked for one specific screen reader, which is the one that blind developer had done. So we still need to follow our processes of making sure we're collecting from multiple sources instead of optimizing for one and not helping everybody in the process, but it's better than it used to be. And I'm happy to be part of that.
Awesome. So on that note, what work, in addition to things such as making sure you're catering to all the different screen readers or different tooling that people need in order to be efficient in their work, is what additional work still needs to be done in order to make BS more accessible?
It's a great question. And one of it is learning from the new guidelines. Even the guidelines that are still in draft form can teach us things. Like I mentioned, the cognitive test. I recently ran a couple user groups with folks who identified as having a neurodiversity, folks with ADHD, folks on the autistic spectrum and things like that, and learning what the things are that help them. And realistically, right now, it's a lot of learning. And one of the pieces of feedback that we hear loud and clear from this particular community is Visual Studio is noisy. There's a lot of indicator over here. Hey, by the way, this is something that could be better. Hey, by the way, you might want to remove a local variable. Hey, like the way, and
a lot of people experience that.
It is. And the comment that it came out of one of the focus groups was somebody said, it feels like a kid in the background jumping up and down with, hey, mommy, I want this. Hey, mommy, I want this, as opposed to somebody in the background where you could ask them, hey, is there something I could do here? And they could give you feedback when you wanted it.
Yeah.
This is a message we're learning, and we're still trying to figure out the right way to do it. Somebody even just mentioned, I wish for a Zen mode in VS. I really wish for a mode in VS.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. But that actually brings up an interesting topic. What is a Zen mode? When we were first exploring, we actually did a prototype for one. One of the questions was, do you want red squiggles? Some people actually said, yeah, I want to know right then and there if I've got a red squiggle. Some people said, no, I just want to type. Don't wait until the end and then show me everything. And then we even had a third group that said, let me type, wait until I hit dot and move on to the next token and then draw my attention to it. Because don't show me in the middle of my word. I know darn well it's not right in the middle of my word. Let me finish what I'm doing there. And then we started getting into, well, maybe that behavior should be the one that you get by default. Do you really want to know mid-word? And then we started getting into, which of these things should be in a special Zen mode? Which of them should be in default Visual Studio? How many dials do we want to be able? It's something that I really want to do, but I want to do it right. And if I do what I want, that probably almost assuredly is exactly what you want. It goes back to the customizability, and we'll customize it into those options, which has 6,000 options. That's what we end up.
Yeah. I know for me as a personal story, like I use Photoshop all the time in my personal life because I like to do graphic design in my free time and stuff. And I remember when I was first learning it, much like Visual Studio, it was also super noisy and there's just so many tools, you don't know where to start. And I really like that Photoshop has a way to filter the tools that cater to what your specific needs are going to be. So not only can you create your own custom workspace, but you can also use the preset one. So if you're interested in photography related tools, then you can filter out and just get the photography related features and tooling. Or if you're more of a graphic design person like I am, then you get access to the draw tool and all these other different tools that you typically use when you're doing graphic design over something like photography, and just little things like that let you just get the relevant things that are meaningful to you instead of all the excess is really cool. And I wish that Visual Studio had something like that later down the line. That would be my personal Zen mode.
I agree with you. And Blend originally had a design mode and an animation mode, and it had two different workspaces. And when you're drawing out your controls on your screen, it showed you these panels. You could get the other panels, but it limited. And then, okay, now I want to go into animation mode. And you had the nice big timeline along the bottom that you could do. Actually, interestingly, Office, what it does with the ribbon is kind of what you're talking about there. I want to be in layout mode, and here's the tools for layout. I'm not sure a ribbon controls the right answer for Visual Studio, and I imagine there's probably a few people who just clicked off this video. If he's going to talk about ribbons in Visual Studio, I don't want to hear it. But yeah. I think that's actually a great idea, and the fact that Visual Studio right now, you go into or out of debug mode, and in debug you get a different set of tools than you get when you're out of debug mode. How many more modes could there be? This was another avenue that had come out of the Zen mode discussions. Yeah. Should there be a coding mode, and coding just shows these? Should there be a investigation mode, which has got better tools for navigating around and code discovery and things along those lines?
Yeah, I always thought there could be like a beginner mode where it's just like, look, I just want to hit F5 and run my project, but I don't even know where the start button is. So like, here's the like basic things that you need in order to successfully run your program from the get.
I don't need the Server Explorer or the Toolbox when I'm trying to do a console-based Hello World. Absolutely. And I know one of my colleagues has done extensive work on that first experience, first coming in, and I know they in particular. How do you get somebody to launch Visual Studio the first time and come back for a second? The number of people who try it once and then just, no, this is too much. This is too intimidating. It's enough that we've got a team dedicated to understanding that. It's a tricky problem because everything that we do to help those folks be more comfortable with Visual Studio, the more experienced users who have learned the Gordian knot that is regular expressions and find in files. They don't want an easy mode. They know how to do what they want to do. Actually, it's that fools. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. It's like, I hate when I've got muscle memory that does one thing and then you try to help me and make things easier. Well, the quote example that they mentioned, that was done there to help people reduce shortcuts. There are reduced typos of not putting the second quote in. Or if we didn't put the second quote in, all of a sudden IntelliSense would give you all the red underlines because you now have invalid XML code. That was there to help the beginners, but it gets in the way of the folks who already are used to it, and it forces them to change their muscle memory. So it's a tricky problem. And it's again, the other half of my job is the editor, and this is definitely a space where we get a lot of people saying, you did this, you made things harder for me, change it back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we also made things easier for a lot of people. How do we draw the line?
Right.
And yeah, as long as you can turn things off, yeah, that's the configurability. That's the challenge. But again, with configurability comes additional costs and testing, and it's a two-edged. Well, okay, it's more two-edged, but it's definitely a sword that we have to ask ourselves every day.
Yeah. So regarding things that aren't there yet, but you'd like to see, what accessibility feature in Visual Studio would you like to work on or see the most?
Probably the biggest one I want, from a more tactical standpoint, the IntelliSense experience for screen readers is one that I really want to just get in there and overhaul. It really feels like it works kind of like you could walk from Detroit to Las Vegas. Yeah, technically you could. I wouldn't want to, but you could. And a world of respect to the folks who have managed to get it to do what they want it to do. I think it's an area that we could do a lot better on. Zen mode is one that I really feel personally, like I said, as a developer with ADHD, I think it would give me a lot of value. I have the focus assist mode in Windows. The first day I found that, I turned it on, and I haven't turned it off since. And I would love something like that in Visual Studio. Another one that I would love to do is audio cues. This is kind of goes into the story I mentioned before about telemetry. Visual Studio used to have a lot more audio cues that you could hook events up to. Make a sound when I hit a breakpoint. Make a sound when there used to be a lot of those. Turned out usage was extremely low. A lot of people didn't use it. And over time, we just stopped prioritizing it. And, we're porting this feature over. Now don't worry about the audio cues. Screen reader users really love audio cues. So that very small usage number was a lot of the screen reader users, and they would love to have that back. I want to get in there and provide more options for folks to hook up those audio cues to say, when I'm on the line with a breakpoint, make a noise for me so I know I'm on the line. When I'm doing a find in files search, let me know when that search is done, and then I can go through and start iterating through my feedback and things like that. Those are just a couple areas that different communities, but I would turn some of those on. I am sighted. I can see. I use a keyboard and a mouse, but I would find use for those myself. Mm-hmm. But many developers who, especially when we were in team rooms at the office and everybody was in the room, they certainly didn't want to hear a bing from everybody's machine all over the room when somebody did.
Sure.
It needs to be configurable, and it needs to be something that is approachable and is enough to be valuable to hit enough avenues, but not so much to be overwhelming. And that's again another one that we're going to be talking to the community every time. We've got the blog post has got a link to a developer community ticket about that specifically. I don't want to hear folks just tell me, yeah, I want audio cues. I want to know where are the places where it would be useful. We could put them all over the place, and before you know it, you're going to be able to play music just by trying to code, because it's going to be doing all of these weird sounds all over the place. Let's not do that. Let's not make Visual Studio literally noisier than it already is.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation related to this earlier where, because on the testing side for VS, they recently released audio cues for that, where you can play different audio cues if the test was successful or if it failed. I thought that was really cool. but
Yeah.
it's also an option. Like you don't have to use that, obviously, but the option is there, which is great.
That one, that all came out of kind of an interesting story. I'll share this one. From the same team, developer, engineer on the team, my name is John. He was working with the Test Explorer and wanted to find out how it could be better. He knew we were meeting all the guidelines. He knew everything as far as what you had to do was right, but he wanted to go a little bit further. So he reached out to a blind developer who works here at Microsoft by the name of Rob, and basically started asking, show me what it's like with the screen reader. Show me your workflow and how can it be better? And I'll give you one example. There was a checkbox that said no tests selected. They changed it to no tests checked. So not a big difference. Well, the difference is selected is 3 syllables, checked is 1. When you've got a screen reader, this meant a difference of a couple milliseconds when that was being read. And no test selected was being read dozens of times every hour. And shaving off just a couple milliseconds off that many iterations actually made it feel better. From a user experience side, on the productive, on kind of using our user guidelines, we had a checkbox. It didn't matter whether we said the word selected or checked. It didn't actually mean anything to the sighted user, but to the screen reader user, it was just a little bit of frustration that he was able to remove with that small change. And the test team did some, the automated test team, is that the right team? That team, they did some great work in accessibility and did exactly what I'm encouraging more of our engineers to do and our program managers. Get in there, understand the experience that blind developers, deaf developers, folks who have motion impairment, folks who have a cognitive disability, things like that, find out what their specific pain points are. And in many cases, they're small fixes that mean a huge difference to that community. And it helps everybody feel the way we want them to feel, which is that they are welcome. This user experience has been designed for them.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it right.
Yeah. And, why have the bare minimum for one group when you can go above and beyond and, make it actual, like an efficient use of your time, just like anybody else who's using the same product. So
right on.
That's so sweet. So with accessibility, and you've mentioned just general guidance that you try to follow, for all the developers out there who are working on their own software and features and are trying to make them more accessible, what would you say are some general tips for how to make your product more accessible?
Well, the first answer I would give every team out there is find people who have as many disabilities as you can, ask them to use your software and see what they can give back. This isn't realistic for a lot of developers. If you can't, the next best thing, use automated tools. I can't say enough good things about accessibility insights. It's a Microsoft product. We partner with them. It's open source, but they're very reactive. Their goal is to reduce false positives as much as possible. So if it reports a bug to you, it's a legitimate bug. Tools like that are great. And thirdly, if you can, try unplugging your mouse and see how far you can get with your software. If you can, narrator is built into every build of Windows in existence. It's a built-in tool. Try and see how far you can get with magnifier or narrator or those. It is very challenging to use a screen reader. As a sighted user, I spent a week with JAWS, and by the end of that week, I was moderately confident that I could send an email. So it's a ways to go, but you can do it, and it will give you an understanding of, for instance, with a screen reader, they have separate keys to say, read the entire line I'm on, read the word I'm on, or read the character I'm on. And when you read the character, don't say A, B, or C, say Alpha, Bravo, or Charlie using the NATO phonetic alphabet to be able to know what those characters are. Use a Braille display. Okay, I don't use a Braille display, but thinking about the perspective that a Braille display gives you, imagine being able to code when you can only be aware of one line and only 80 characters of that line. How is that changing the way you're going to respond to doing it? Now, again, I'm talking specifically about Visual Studio, but for anybody out there, there's no better the best is folks who actually live with the disability, getting their feedback. The next best thing is just spend a day and try to use it yourself with those tools. And it helps. It helps a lot just getting that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, being able to get that information from the source, aka people who have those lived experiences, that's like awesome in any case. But obviously, it's not always the easiest thing to do for a lot of people. But if you can do it, it's great no matter what context of app or piece of software that you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question there in the chat. Are you talking about screen reader as part of VS with special characteristics? What I'm talking about there is trying to use Visual Studio as a screen reader user. This may or may not be answering the question. If you want to clarify, please feel free. But with Visual Studio, there really are, in application development, there's two sides of it. There's a blind developer using Visual Studio and how well Visual Studio can be used with a screen reader. Then there's a separate side of using Visual Studio to make applications that somebody else can use with a screen reader. And we haven't really even talked about that second half of it. As a sighted developer, I can make an application, sure, but it would be nice if Visual Studio had more tools built into it to help me at the development time know that my users are going to be have an easier time using the tool. And this is what we call accessibility tooling, and we're exploring that right now. One of the things that we would love to do, very simple, well, conceptually simple, but as with anything in application development, it's not really that easy. But being able to, during a debugging session, when you've got your application up, hey, you know, what if I just pressed a button in Visual Studio and it ran the Accessibility Insights engine on it and told me right then and there, hey, here are the issues that you've got. And I was speaking with one of the program managers on the desktop development team, the XAML team, and they've got the live visual tree that shows all the UI elements. What if while you were looking at your application in the debugger, it could tell you, hey, this element up here, it's got accessibility. Oh, this one down here, it's also got one. Right then and there, you would be able to detect those issues. Desktop development is tricky because there are ways that you can get the accessibility right in the XAML or markup, and there are ways you could do it in the code behind. And we could statically analyze your XAML, but that wouldn't detect the things that you're fixing behind the scenes. It wouldn't detect dynamically generated JavaScript content, for instance. There's no way to detect that. So it has to be done at runtime. So this is something that we're exploring. And again, we'd love to get feedback from developers who are interested in that to know, you know, what got you started on that journey? What are tools that would be useful for you? Should we prioritize application web development or application desktop development? Is there one that's easier than the other? These are the questions that, again, we want to talk to developers who are doing that. And interestingly, it's been an area that I've been having a surprisingly hard time talking to engineers out there outside of Microsoft who are prioritizing accessibility the way we are, but that's growing. I would have said 5 years ago, actually, the director of PM had asked me if we wanted to do accessibility testing, is there interest in it? And I said, let me go find it. And I had a hard time doing it. Now I'm finding more and more developers who are saying, look, we've got European Union guidelines that we have to meet. We need this tooling. How do we get it into Visual Studio? For now, you've got Accessibility Insights, and we're looking and we want that feedback, and we're hoping to do it more in the tool itself to do that shift left, help me find it that much earlier.
Awesome. So what's next for accessibility in Visual Studio, and where can people go to learn more about it?
What's next? Well, as I mentioned, there is the blog post that I put up, the AKAMS VSA11Y. That has got some of the things that we're thinking about. I talk a little bit about kind of the journey we're on and a few of the items that represent signals that we've picked up. These are things that people have told us, like the example with the spaces versus tabs, and we're looking for people to engage there. Additionally, developer community. If you've been told before, thank you for your suggestion, but you know that's not something we're prioritizing now because it doesn't affect enough people, I'd like to invite you to give us that suggestion again. I've tried to reactivate many of these, but keep coming. Give us that chance to kind of earn the trust back that we are taking that stuff seriously. I am, like I mentioned before, I believe that there are accessibility features that we could do that probably wouldn't be that expensive, that would make a lot of people's lives better. We don't know about them. And until we know about them, it's just going to stay in the back of your mind. Help us get it into ours. So the blog that I linked to, developer community, there are links in the blog post. If you're in Visual Studio, at the top right or under the help menu, there is a give feedback. Any of these avenues, we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Feel free to poke at me on Twitter, any route that we've got. And from there, what's next? What's next is hearing those signals, developing those features, and getting them out to the community, getting them in early stage, getting the preview feedback, all of those kinds of things. That's what we're looking for right now.
Absolutely. And before we close out, we got one question from chat. With the text-based GUIs of the early 1990s, was accessibility better or worse than today with web SPAs?
So I graduated from college in '97 and went into the industry immediately. And the IDE that I used was Emacs. This was a purely text-based. There was no GUI. In fact, the first builds I used didn't even use the mouse. Okay. Might have been able to use the mouse, but I remember having enough problems with it on the Sun Unix workstations that we were working on that I just didn't. I got used to not using the mouse. And accessibility for Emacs was great. In fact, if you ask a lot of Bind developers today what is the best experience for coding, they will tell you Emacs Speak, which was basically an extension of that. So accessibility used to be great, but accessibility in the early days of modern UI didn't have that much UI, and a lot of it was very simple. For instance, in the old implementations of a lot of the screen reader tools, all you could do was invoke a mouse down or invoke a drag or something like that. Where modern UIA, the new standard APIs, allow you to do things like change selection and abstract away some of the concepts. So it's better, but that makes it harder to code correctly. So it has more features, but it's harder for developers to do all the features right. So it's kind of a tricky question. And the statement back, you should promote GUIs to build user interfaces. You're not wrong. And that's where I would love to have more tools built into the designers. I know the head PM who owns the WinForms designer. I've talked to the PMs on the XAML desktop designers. These are things that we want to do. And when we do it, it's going to be based on the feedback and the demand from the community to say, yes, this is valuable for us. Show us and help us do that.
Awesome. So that's all the time that we have today, but thank you so much, Dante, for coming on the show and talking about this. I think it's such an important topic, and it's still constantly changing and rapidly evolving and becoming more and more of a priority for developers. So I think it's really important that we have these kinds of conversations. So developers, if you want to learn more, definitely follow Dante if you don't already on Twitter. He's great and has a lot of knowledge about this accessibility space. So if you have any additional questions or want to learn more, then you should definitely ping him on Twitter. Otherwise, also go check out his blog. We posted the link in the chat as well as a banner. So definitely go check that out. Or you can just go to Visual Studio blog, that site, and find it there. It just came out today. So definitely go check that out. And as Dante mentioned, share your feedback. Seriously, like because accessibility is still a space we're all learning about, we may not be aware of certain contexts or situations that people are experiencing unless you share them with us. So your feedback matters. And yeah.
Absolutely. Leslie, thanks so much. Glad to have this chance. And yeah, I'd love to talk to people. This is a space I can't learn everything. I just want to learn as much as I can. And I want to know from individual folks, what are their pain points, and we can grow from there. So thank you so much for the chance to reach out and talk to your folks.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. So with that, everybody, happy coding.
Thanks so much.